Hi everyone, welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to have a look at creating enemies in Pygame. If you're not up to date, we're now on to lesson 4, creating enemies, which is a branch in my GitHub. So you'll find the link in the description. Now, we're going to be doing a lot of what we did in the last couple of lessons. That is, we're going to create another sprite. And this time, the sprite we're going to create is called enemy. So let's have a look what's inside the enemy sprite. So for the enemy.py file, where we're going to define our sprite, I've got import Pygame. I'm going to bring in my globals, just as I have for every file. And my globals are always the variables that I'm saving inside the game namespace. I'm going to import in math and time because it could be useful to us. I'm going to define the class enemy, and again, it's going to inherit from the Pygame sprite class. For my enemy, I'm just going to bring it its position. So I'm going to define an X and a Y variable. Obviously, you could change that however you want to bring in your enemy and how you want to customize your enemy. But for myself, I really just care about where the enemy is going to be positioned on the screen. Just like with all our sprite objects, you must call the init function using the keyword super, which basically says call the init function inside this Pygame sprite class. I'm going to define my image, and I'm going to load an image. So I have downloaded an image called alien.png, and I'm also going to scale that image, which I haven't covered a lot of, but you don't have to scale it. It really depends on what size the image is, but I think I decided for mine that I would scale it. And then don't worry about original image. That's if you want to rotate. I'm going to give it a direction. For the moment, I'm just going to set the direction. I mean, I could have passed in the direction if I wanted to. So if I wanted to set the direction, I could have. It's really up to you. I've just decided that initially my enemy is going to move at a direction of horizontal. So it's going to go 1 horizontal, 0 vertical, but then I'm going to set it a speed of 3. So you can imagine that it's going to go 3 times 1 horizontal, and it's going to keep adding that to its position. Then in terms of the positioning, I have to get the rectangle. Every sprite, you must get the rectangle from the image. I'm then going to set its position, and then I'm going to realign the rectangle with that sprite's position. And then finally, I said last lesson that we'd add all the bullets or the lasers to a bullet group. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for my enemy group. And the reason why is if I create a sprite group, I will be able to, and you'll see this later on, I'll be able to detect all the collisions using one line of code. So I'm going to add all my enemies. So you imagine how this enemy is going to I'm going to create a number of these enemies. I'm going to add them to a sprite group, and the variable name is game enemy group. So let's just quickly create that enemy group. So inside main, I'm going to want to, I don't need to import enemy. What I do want to do is I'm going to create an enemy group. So you can see how I've got bullet group is a sprite group here, and enemy group is directly below it, just so that when I create an enemy, I automatically add it to the enemy group. Right. Next step, I'm going to give it an update function. With my update function, all I'm going to do is update its position. So its position will equal itself plus the speed times its direction. I'm going to realign its center. And that's all I'm going to do for the moment. So you can see I've got my enemy objects now ready to go. I don't have a draw function, remembering that if it's on a sprite group or it's part of a sprite group, you don't need a draw function. because the actual sprite group will call the draw function for you. So that's one of the advantages of using sprite groups. But if I go to main, I do need a way of creating enemies. And the question is, how am I going to create an enemy? Well, one of the ways we can do it is by creating an event. And we haven't spoken much about events, but in my game loop, I've always left a space there for an event. So you can see for event in pygame.event get, and at the moment I've just got if the event type is equal to quit, which by the way, I think I've used this as constants. So there is actually, just to be consistent, I have actually, in my earlier tutorials, I called this constants.quit. I mean, it will still, it should still work if I've spelled that right. Oh, see, sorry. What I meant to do is actually import as constants. Sorry, I didn't have to do this, but it's just better this way because you might be unfamiliar with what I did there. All right, but again, you didn't have to do that. So I've got to have a way of actually making it so that my enemies will appear on the screen. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define an event for an enemy. So this is just one way of defining an event. So I'm going to say, okay, well, create enemy event is a variable, and I'm going to define it to a user event plus 1. The user event is like an integer, and you just keep adding 1 or adding 2 for each number of your event, just to make it unique. So that's defining my event. And in this event queue, I'm going to want to look for that event. So I'm going to say, if event type is equal to create enemy event, I'm going to create an enemy at that position. And then I've got to have a way of actually launching the event. And there's a couple of things here. So, and you note that currently it doesn't detect enemy, name not defined. So we'll need to go up the top here and make sure that I import my enemy. So it's going to import my enemy class from the enemy file. But what I want to do is make it so that my event is launched. At the moment, my event isn't launched. Nothing's going to happen. So to do that, you can actually create what's called a timer. And if I have a look at my start game area of my game loop, the last thing I probably want to do is make it so that when I've started my game, I'm going to start this timer. So to start a timer, I say pygame.time.setTimer. I tell it the name of the event that I want to be run, and then I give it the time that I want to run it in. So I'm going to give it the time of 1 second, which is 1,000 milliseconds. So the Pygame timer takes milliseconds. Right, so that's going to launch my first timer. And next thing you know, we're now, because we've just gone here and you've just clicked to start the game, that's going to launch the game. But then in my event queue, it will trigger this event, but I need to keep triggering the same event over and over again. For a true timer to keep working as a loop, I need to trigger that same event. So in my event queue, I'm just going to trigger it again. So you can imagine what's happened is, under start game, the user has just clicked the mouse button, it's created the spaceship object, it started the music, and then I set a timer to create an enemy in 1 second. And then my event queue, which is here, it launches that event 1 second later, creates the enemy on my screen at position 1010, and then sets another timer that will do it all over again. So this is then going to trigger this event 1 second later, which then triggers that event 1 second later. So you can imagine how, independent of the frame rate, I'm actually getting it to do a time-based event. So that's the event queue there. Okay, the last thing we need to do is we need to update the enemies on the screen, because that's something we haven't done. I mean, I don't need to, using a sprite group, I don't need to do the draw. Oh, yes, I do. Sorry, I do need to do the draw. Where I've got game.bullet group, I do need to draw the enemy group. So it's going to draw all the enemies are going to be drawn using that one line of code. But I also need to update all the enemies as well. So this is very similar code to what you saw last lesson. We updated all the bullets. We're going to update all the enemies. So using the sprite group, it's going to update every sprite that's in the group. And using the enemy group, it's going to draw every enemy in the group. So now, if we run the code, hopefully, it should be creating enemies on our screen. Right, so you can see the enemies are being created right at the top of the screen, but at the moment they're just running off the screen. They still exist, by the way, but they are off the screen. So there's a couple of things I will want to do. One of the things I'll want to do is when I create the enemy, let's push the enemy down a bit. So I'm going to say enemies 10, 20. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to make it so that my enemy, when it gets to the end of the screen, is actually going to bounce off and kind of go a bit lower. Kind of like a Space Invaders type motion. So I'm going to go to my enemy sprite. And in my enemy sprite where I've got update, I can actually test to see if the sprite is outside the rectangle. So I'm going to get the rectangle of the screen. So that's my screen rectangle. And then I'm going to say, if inside game, I'm going to go, is sprite outside rectangle? By the way, if you haven't seen where this function is coming from, I created this function myself because I wanted it to be a bit more complicated. Well, not really complicated. I want it to be more powerful than the sprite rec detection that we did inside the laser class. I wanted a function that would do a bit more than that. And I've saved that function inside game globals. So if you go to game globals, you'll see there is this function called isSprite outside rectangle. If wrap is equal to false, then it won't wrap around to the other side of the rectangle. And if a line is equal to false, it won't align it with the rectangle. But if you have a line as true, it will align it to whatever boundary it's collided with. And if you have wrap is equal to true, it'll wrap around to the other side. So for me, I want my Space Invader to go to the side, and instead of actually necessarily wrapping to the other side, I just want to move it down and then across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if the game.sprite is outside the rectangle, I'm going to pass it the screen rect, I'm going to align it so that it's going to be aligned with the edge that it collided with. I'm going to reverse the direction of my enemy. And I'm actually going to add on 80 pixels in the downward direction. So in this way, the sprite should move downwards. So let's see how that goes. So I'm going to press play. And hopefully, we should see it get to the edge of the screen. It will align itself with the edge of the screen and then move downwards on the screen. So here we go. Press play. Now, the only problem is it's actually aligning straight away. Notice how it just went down straight away? The reason it's going down straight away is it's actually colliding with the left part of my screen, which isn't ideal. So I'm going to have to move it across a bit. But otherwise, you can see that it is working the way I intended, except there's no collisions at the moment. So let's just put in, simply fix up that alignment. Actually, sorry, what I need to do is change its position, its starting position. So to change its starting position, I'm just going to create the enemy at 2020. And hopefully, I wonder if I need to do more than that, but I think if it's at 2020, it should be okay. And I haven't got any other collisions going yet. I'll talk more about collisions colliding with bullets in a lesson later on. So I think that will conclude this particular lesson. Let's just make sure it's all working, and then we'll do some more in the next lesson. Still colliding straight away, which isn't ideal. So I think I just need to move it across even more than it currently is. So when I create the enemy, let's move it across like 80. And hopefully that should fix the problem. I will fix it by the next lesson. All right, I'll see you guys, and see you later.